Marissa had always been drawn to the past. Her fascination with vintage clothing, especially old wedding dresses, led her to a quaint little shop tucked away in the back alley of a bustling city. The place was called Eternal Love, a name that seemed more fitting for a funeral parlor than a boutique. But Marissa didn't mind. She loved how it smelled, of dust and lavender, and the way the dim lighting made everything feel like a dream. On her third visit to the shop, she found it. An antique wedding dress, the kind she had only seen in the old photographs of her grandmother's wedding album. The lace was delicate, the fabric almost translucent, with intricate embroidery along the hemline. It felt as if the dress had a soul of its own, and Marissa felt an undeniable pull to it. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp, knowing eyes, seemed to watch Marissa with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "It's a beautiful dress," the woman said in a voice that trembled like a distant memory. "But be careful. It carries more than just the weight of fabric." Marissa chuckled, brushing off the remark. "I'm sure it's just a dress, right?" she said, smiling as she ran her fingers over the soft, faded silk. But the shopkeeper didn't smile back. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes never leaving Marissa's face. After paying, Marissa left the shop with the dress carefully wrapped in tissue paper, its history hidden beneath layers of time. She didn't give much thought to the shopkeeper's cryptic warning, her excitement overwhelming any concerns. The dress was perfect, and she was eager to wear it for an upcoming charity event. But things began to change soon after. That night, as Marissa prepared to hang the dress in her closet, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw someone standing behind her. An image of a woman in a wedding gown, her face pale and streaked with tears. The figure vanished before Marissa could even react, but the chill it left behind lingered in the air. The next few nights were even stranger. Marissa began to feel as though she were being watched. While lying in bed, she could hear the soft rustling of fabric, as if the dress were moving on its own. And sometimes, just as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a sudden coldness, a freezing sensation creeping up her spine, before a pair of unseen hands seemed to tighten around her neck. Marissa gasped for air, her heart racing, but when she opened her eyes, the feeling would vanish, leaving her breathless in the darkness. She tried to rationalize it, stress from her job, perhaps, or the weight of her recent breakup. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. One evening, as she was brushing her hair in front of the bathroom mirror, she saw the bride again. This time, the woman's face was clearer, her expression twisted in sorrow. She was crying, her eyes hollow as if she had been weeping for years. Marissa froze, unable to tear her gaze away. The bride reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the glass, leaving behind a streak of fog. Marissa stumbled backward, her breath shallow. The figure was gone, but the image of the bride's mournful face stayed with her. She had to get to the bottom of this. The dress, the warnings, the strange occurrences, it was all connected, and Marissa was determined to uncover the truth. The next day, Marissa returned to Eternal Love. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had been happening. The shopkeeper's warning echoed in her ears, but she hadn't paid it any real attention before. Now, it felt like a premonition she had ignored at her peril. She needed answers, and there was no way she would leave without them. When she arrived, the shop was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of the city, the chatter of pedestrians and the hum of passing cars, seemed to fade away, swallowed by the thick, oppressive air that surrounded the little shop. The door creaked open as Marissa stepped inside, the bell above it ringing with a mournful sound. The shelves, stacked high with old lace and silk, appeared untouched by time, as if they existed in a world apart from the modern one. The shopkeeper, as though expecting her, was standing near the back, her sharp eyes fixed on Marissa. "I knew you'd return," the woman said in a low voice. "You've seen her, haven't you?" Marissa nodded, feeling an unsettling chill creep over her skin. "The bride," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who is she? What's happening to me?" The shopkeeper's gaze softened, her face reflecting a sorrow Marissa couldn't fully understand. She gestured for Marissa to sit, and the two women moved to a small, dusty chair near the counter. Her name was Evelyn. She was the last bride to wear that dress, and her story is a tragic one. Marissa leaned forward, captivated despite herself. What happened to her? The shopkeeper's eyes seemed to grow distant, as if recalling something painful. Evelyn was supposed to marry the love of her life, a man named Charles. They were the perfect couple, young and full of hope. But on the eve of their wedding, Charles disappeared. No one knew where he went. Some said he left her, others said he was dead. But Evelyn never believed it. She waited for him, year after year, never taking off the dress, convinced that he would return. Marissa's heart sank. The sorrow in the shopkeeper's voice was unmistakable, and it sent a shiver down her spine. And then, the woman's lips trembled, and she looked down at her hands. She never stopped waiting. Eventually she died, alone, in that very dress. Some say her spirit still lingers, trapped in the fabric, mourning the man who never came back. The dress, it holds her grief, her anger, and her longing. Marissa felt a wave of nausea. But why now? Why is she showing herself to me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The shopkeeper's eyes met hers, and for the first time Marissa saw a flicker of fear in them. Because you touched it. The dress is cursed. It's not just fabric, it's a vessel, a conduit, and when you bought it, you unknowingly awakened Evelyn's spirit. Now she's trying to tell you something, she's trying to finish her story. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. What does she want from me? She whispered, her mind racing with the possibilities. Was she supposed to find Charles? Was she supposed to free Evelyn from her endless wait? The shopkeeper gave her a long, silent look before standing up. You must understand this. The past is never truly gone. It lingers, waiting for those who are sensitive enough to listen. But be warned, spirits like hers are not easily appeased. Marissa's chest tightened with a mix of dread and curiosity. She stood, clutching the edges of the counter for support. How can I stop it? I don't want this. I just want to be free. The shopkeeper's eyes darkened. I don't know, but if you continue down this path, you may end up like her, waiting forever. As Marissa left the shop, the air felt heavier than ever, as if the weight of Evelyn's grief was pressing down on her chest. The streets seemed quieter now, the world more oppressive. She had to find a way to break free, but she wasn't sure how much of her own soul she was willing to risk. That night, as Marissa lay in bed, she heard the soft whisper of fabric moving again. The temperature in the room dropped, and she could almost feel Evelyn's presence beside her. Her fingers twitched at her neck, where the cold touch had once strangled her breath, and the sensation came again, tighter this time. But there was something different. Something in the air seemed to hum with anticipation. Marissa gasped, her eyes snapping open. In the mirror across the room she saw it, the bride, standing behind her, weeping uncontrollably. Her hands, pale and trembling, reached out, as though begging Marissa to listen. Marissa's heart pounded as she stared into the mirror. The bride's face was no longer the fleeting image it had once been. This time, Evelyn's sorrowful eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. She was no longer just a phantom, an echo of grief. Now, she was alive, at least in some twisted, ghostly way. Trembling, Marissa slowly rose from her bed, her eyes never leaving the mirror. The room was colder than it had ever been, and the air felt thick, as though the very space around her was suffocating. Her skin crawled with the sensation of invisible hands brushing over her, sending shivers down her spine. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The figure in the mirror moved, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The air in the room seemed to warp, distorting her features, as if Evelyn's anguish was becoming too much for the world to bear. Marissa's own reflection was now mingling with the bride's, as though they were merging into one entity. Marissa stepped back, but the coldness wrapped around her like a vice, and before she could move, she felt it, a pressure on her chest, as if something was suffocating her from the inside. She gasped, struggling to breathe, but her throat tightened. Panic set in, and she clawed at her neck, trying to loosen the invisible grip. Suddenly, the pressure lifted, and Marissa collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. She looked up, and the bride was gone, leaving only the cold, oppressive silence in her wake. Her pulse raced, her thoughts a whirl of confusion and fear. Was this just another hallucination? Was she losing her mind? But deep down, Marissa knew she wasn't imagining things. There was something real here. The dress, the bride, the unexplainable feelings. It was all connected. and the fact that she could feel Evelyn's presence growing stronger meant one thing: the spirit wasn't going to let her go. Not until she finished whatever it was she needed to do. Marissa could no longer ignore the growing sense of urgency. She had to find out more about Evelyn, who she had been, how she had died, and most importantly, how to end this madness. But every time she thought she had a clear path forward, her mind was clouded with images of the bride's sorrowful eyes. The next morning, Marissa returned to the library, determined to uncover whatever she could about the woman who had once owned the dress. She pored over old newspapers, dusty records, and any scrap of information she could find about Evelyn and her mysterious fiancé, Charles. But every lead turned up a dead end. There was nothing concrete, just rumors and whispers, nothing that could explain why the spirit was now haunting her. Frustrated, Marissa sat back, her eyes fixed on the pages before her. There was one thing she hadn't tried. The shopkeeper had mentioned the dress being more than just a piece of clothing. If she could learn more about the origins of the dress, perhaps it would lead her to the truth. The fabric, the stitching, the history of the designer, everything about the dress might hold the key. But as Marissa prepared to leave, she felt it again, the coldness creeping up behind her. She turned slowly, but no one was there. Instead, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and she saw her breath mist in front of her. The mirrors around her began to fog, and once again she saw the bride's image in the glass, her tear-streaked face hauntingly familiar. The woman's lips moved, though no sound came out. Marissa leaned in, straining to hear. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, Evelyn spoke. "Help me find him." Marissa recoiled, her heart racing. Was this the message she had been waiting for? Was Charles the key? If she could find him, maybe she could set Evelyn's restless spirit free. But there was still so much she didn't understand. Why had Charles disappeared? Why had Evelyn never given up on him? And most terrifying of all, what would happen if she couldn't solve the mystery in time? With a renewed sense of purpose, Marissa left the library. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but she was determined to finish it. Evelyn's spirit had chosen her for a reason, and she wasn't about to let the ghost of a broken bride drag her into the same endless waiting. But as she made her way to the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past was closing in on her. And with each step, she was getting closer to something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Marissa's search for answers led her to a small, quiet town on the outskirts of the city, where whispers of Evelyn's past seemed to linger like the fog that clung to the ground. The town's library was small but well kept, with faded newspaper clippings and dusty old books piled high on shelves that creaked under the weight of time. It was here that Marissa finally uncovered a lead, buried beneath layers of forgotten history. She had come across a clipping from a local newspaper dated back over 50 years. The headline read, "Local man disappears before wedding day, groom never seen again." The article was short, only a few paragraphs long, but it painted a picture that made Marissa's stomach twist. Charles, the man Evelyn had loved, had mysteriously vanished the night before their wedding. No sign of him had ever been found, and the town's residents speculated for years about what had happened to him. Marissa's fingers trembled as she read the names of the people who had been closest to Evelyn and Charles. There was a mention of a family home that once stood near the edge of the town, but it had been abandoned long ago. The final paragraph of the article was the most chilling. Many believe that Evelyn never let go of the past. It is said she still waits for her lost love at the old house, where the two were last seen together. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Marissa had a feeling she was close. This was where she needed to go next. She had to see the old house, to understand what had happened to Charles, and perhaps, in doing so, she could find a way to release Evelyn from her torment. With a sense of growing urgency, Marissa rented a car and drove toward the outskirts of town, following the directions she had pieced together from the article. The road grew narrower, the trees thickening on either side, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. As she turned a bend in the road, she saw it. A crumbling stone house, overgrown with ivy and shadowed by a canopy of trees. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and empty, as though the house itself had been forgotten by time. Marissa parked the car and stepped out into the cool air. Her heart raced in her chest as she approached the house. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave the past where it belonged. But Evelyn's voice, faint but persistent, echoed in her mind, urging her forward. She had to know the truth. The front door was ajar, its wood warped and peeling. Marissa pushed it open, the creaking of the door echoing through the empty house. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. She moved cautiously through the house, each step careful, as though the very floorboards might give way beneath her. In the living room, she found an old photograph, framed and faded with age. It was a picture of Evelyn and Charles, their faces bright with the joy of youth and love. Marissa stared at the image for a long moment, her pulse quickening. This was it. This was the moment they had shared before everything went wrong. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the open window, and the house seemed to come alive. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as she heard it. The soft rustling of fabric, the whisper of someone moving just out of sight. She turned, heart racing, but there was no one there. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if Evelyn's spirit were right beside her. As Marissa continued through the house, she felt the temperature drop, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She followed the sound of the fabric rustling to a staircase at the back of the house. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended, and at the top, she saw a door slightly ajar. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty except for an old, moth-eaten chair in the center, its cushions faded and threadbare. But it was the mirror on the wall that caught her attention. Unlike the other mirrors she had encountered, this one was pristine, its glass reflecting her image perfectly. As Marissa stepped closer, she saw something else in the reflection. A woman, dressed in the same wedding gown, standing in the background. Her face was obscured by a veil, but Marissa could see the outline of her figure, the long, flowing fabric that seemed to move even though there was no wind. The figure began to move toward Marissa, its presence unmistakable. Evelyn was there, but this time she wasn't crying. Her expression was one of desperation, of longing. She was reaching out, her hands trembling as if trying to communicate something. Marissa took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the question feeling like a plea for mercy. Evelyn's image faded, and in her place, Marissa saw the faintest outline of a man, a figure she had not noticed before. He was standing in the corner, his face hidden in shadow. Slowly he stepped forward, his face coming into focus. Charles. Marissa's heart stopped. She had found him, or at least part of him. His eyes were hollow, dark, as if drained of life. But there was a look of recognition in them. "You found me," he whispered, his voice low and broken. "It's too late." Suddenly, the room began to shake. The walls groaned, and the air grew thick with a pressure that made Marissa's ears pop. She stumbled back, her legs giving way beneath her. The figure of Charles began to flicker, fading in and out like a dying candle. Then, in a final burst of energy, his image vanished, leaving only the echo of his voice behind. Marissa was alone again, but the house no longer felt abandoned. The weight of centuries of grief pressed down on her, and she knew that this was the moment of reckoning. Evelyn's story was complete. She had found Charles, but in doing so, she had uncovered the tragic end of a love that could never be. Marissa turned away from the mirror, her body heavy with exhaustion. As she walked out of the house, the cold seemed to lift, the air clearing as if Evelyn's spirit had finally found peace. She had freed them both in a way, by uncovering the truth. But some stories, no matter how much you wish them to end, never truly do. And as Marissa left the old house behind, she knew she would never forget the woman in the wedding dress, nor the love that had bound them both to the past. When Sarah first saw the vintage wedding dress, she was entranced. It was tucked away in the far corner of an old secondhand shop, bathed in the soft glow of a dusty lamp. The lace on the gown was delicate, intricate, and faded with age, but it still held a timeless beauty. She hadn't been looking for a wedding dress. Sarah wasn't even engaged. But there was something about the dress that drew her in. as though it had a story to tell. She could almost hear it calling her name, a soft whisper in the back of her mind. Without a second thought, she handed the shopkeeper the money, eager to take the dress home. The moment the dress crossed the threshold of her apartment, a chill seemed to settle in the air. Sarah brushed it off as the remnants of a long day and the draft from the cracked windows. But as she carefully hung the dress in her closet, she noticed something unsettling. There was a faint, almost imperceptible smell of decay in the fabric. It was so subtle that Sarah questioned whether she was imagining it. She dismissed it as just the scent of age. After all, the dress was decades old. She closed the closet door, resolving to look it over in detail later. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, she felt a strange unease creeping into her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The room felt heavier, the air thicker. She turned her head toward the closet, where the dress hung, and felt a shiver run down her spine. For a moment, she thought she saw a flash of movement, like a figure standing in the corner of the room, but when she blinked, it was gone. Sarah rolled over, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. As the days passed, Sarah began to experience strange occurrences. She would see glimpses of something in the mirrors, an image of a woman in a wedding dress, her face obscured by a veil, silently crying. Sarah would startle and turn around, but the figure was never there. Her reflection seemed to warp, and the air would grow cold, despite the warmth of the room. These moments were fleeting, but they left Sarah feeling unsettled, like something was just beyond her grasp, lurking in the shadows. One evening, as Sarah prepared for bed, she felt the familiar chill again. She sat up, heart racing, and looked toward the closet. The dress was no longer hanging neatly. It had shifted, the fabric now hanging in a loose, almost unnatural way. Sarah took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat as she approached it. The room grew colder still, and she could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her, as though the very space around her was alive. She reached out to touch the dress, but before her fingers made contact, she felt it, a cold hand, like ice, wrap around her neck from behind. Her breath caught in her throat, panic rising in her chest. She spun around, but there was no one there, only the cold, oppressive silence of her apartment. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and she stumbled back from the closet, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, Sarah tried to push the experience from her mind. Perhaps she was just exhausted, or maybe the dress was affecting her in ways she didn't understand. But when she walked into her apartment, the first thing she noticed was the mirror above her vanity. Her reflection was still, but there, in the corner of the glass, she saw it again, the figure of the crying bride, standing in the shadows, watching her. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and confusion. Sarah tried to convince herself that she was simply stressed. Work had been overwhelming, and the dress was an impulse purchase she probably shouldn't have made. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the events grew increasingly impossible to dismiss. The cold sensations at night, the glimpses of the crying bride in the mirrors, Sarah couldn't escape them. She began sleeping with her lights on, but it didn't help. The presence in the room, that heavy, suffocating weight, lingered, and the cold touch around her neck felt more and more like a real physical threat. One night, Sarah decided she had had enough. She couldn't live like this anymore, haunted by visions and sensations she didn't understand. She took the dress from the closet and laid it across her bed. The lace and satin glistened eerily in the moonlight. She stared at it for a long time, wondering if it had some kind of curse attached to it. Maybe the woman who once wore it had been wronged, or her spirit had never left the fabric. Either way, Sarah needed to rid herself of this unbearable weight on her soul. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Sarah visited the second-hand shop the following morning. The old shopkeeper, a wrinkled woman with sharp, knowing eyes, looked up from her knitting when Sarah entered. There was no judgment in her gaze, but there was an unsettling quietness about her. She didn't ask why Sarah had returned. She simply handed her a small, yellowed envelope. "Take it," the shopkeeper said softly. "You may need this." Sarah opened the envelope to find an old photograph. It was a black and white image of a woman standing in front of a church, her eyes closed, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wore the same wedding dress, the one Sarah had bought. The woman's face was faintly recognizable, and as Sarah examined it, something stirred in her mind. The woman's sorrow was palpable, as if the pain of her wedding day had been woven into the very fabric of the dress. But why? What had happened to her? "Who is she?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. The shopkeeper hesitated for a moment before answering. She was a bride once, never made it to her wedding day. Tragedy struck before the vows were spoken. Some say her spirit never left, that she lingers in the dress. She's waiting for something, or someone. Sarah felt a chill run through her body. The realization that she was connected to this tragic woman, even if only by the dress, was too much. She left the shop quickly, clutching the photo and the envelope, feeling the weight of something ancient and sorrowful pressing down on her chest. That night, Sarah could no longer ignore the presence in the apartment. As she lay in bed, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. It wasn't just the dress anymore. It was something more. She could almost hear the woman's voice, faint whispers, like a desperate cry for help. And then the hand came again. Cold fingers wrapped around her throat, tighter this time, as if they were trying to pull her into some dark, unseen space. She gasped, struggling to breathe as the grip tightened. But when she opened her eyes, she saw the woman, the bride, her face now fully visible, her eyes locked onto Sarah's with a haunting intensity. She was standing at the foot of the bed, her form pale and translucent, her wedding gown trailing behind her like a veil of mist. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice distant but urgent. Sarah's heart raced. The air around her crackled with tension, and she felt a deep sorrow, a grief that seemed to tear at her soul. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out a trembling hand toward the apparition, as though to offer comfort or answers. But the bride's eyes flickered with pain, and she vanished, leaving Sarah gasping for air and clutching at her throat. The grip on her neck released as suddenly as it had appeared, but the cold lingered, and the silence in the room was suffocating. The next day, Sarah knew she had to find out more. She couldn't live with this. She needed answers. She turned to the envelope, flipping it open to find a note, written in elegant handwriting. "The dress holds her soul. Only the one who understands her sorrow can release her." The note left Sarah with more questions than answers. The dress holds her soul? The words echoed in her mind as she sat at her kitchen table, the photograph of the crying bride beside her. Sarah felt as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice, peering into a dark, unfathomable void. She couldn't let this go. Whatever was happening, she had to understand it. If the woman in the dress was truly trapped, then perhaps it was her responsibility, somehow, to set her free. That afternoon, Sarah did what she had avoided up until then. She visited the local historical society. The woman at the desk, a stout figure with spectacles perched on the end of her nose, looked at Sarah curiously when she explained her inquiry. "A vintage wedding dress, you say? Sounds like an interesting story. We do have records of the old cheer, if you want to take a look," the librarian said, her voice thick with curiosity. Sarah accepted the offer, sitting at a small table filled with old records and yellowing papers. As she sifted through the faded documents, one name kept cropping up: Eleanor Hartwell. She was a local woman who had been engaged to be married in the late 1920s. According to the records, her fiancé, a wealthy young man named Thomas Winters, had died unexpectedly just days before the wedding. It was a sudden and mysterious death. Some said it was a tragic accident, while others whispered that it was no coincidence. Eleanor, heartbroken and devastated, never married. She reportedly never left her family home, and after a few years, her name disappeared from public memory. Sarah felt a cold chill as she read the final entry. Eleanor Hartwell had been buried in the same wedding dress, her funeral a somber affair with few mourners in attendance. It was as if the woman had faded into nothingness, swallowed by time, her grief sealed within the fabric of the dress. The connection was too clear now. The bride in the mirrors, the cold hands around her neck, the oppressive sorrow hanging in the air, it was all tied to Eleanor's tragedy. She had never had a chance to say goodbye, to mourn, or find closure. And the dress, it was the last piece of her life, the one thing that held her spirit bound to the mortal world. Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was she the one who had to give her that closure? Was she meant to free Eleanor's soul? That night, Sarah sat in front of the dress, holding the photograph of Eleanor in her trembling hands. The bride's eyes seemed to pierce through the paper, her sorrow so raw, so palpable that it nearly consumed Sarah's thoughts. The room was suffused with a coldness that felt almost otherworldly, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of fabric. Sarah whispered aloud, as though speaking to the spirit, "What do you want from me? Why are you here?" The room grew colder still, and a soft, mournful sound filled the air, a voice barely audible but unmistakably desperate. "Help me," it whispered. Sarah's heart pounded as she looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. The figure of Eleanor appeared before her once again, her translucent form standing in the center of the room. She was no longer crying, but the sorrow in her eyes had only deepened, as if it were etched into her very being. "How can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "What do you need?" The apparition raised a hand, pointing toward the closet where the dress hung. A shudder passed through Sarah as she followed the ghost's gaze. The dress, the symbol of Eleanor's lost future, her unfulfilled life, was the key. It was not enough to simply understand the past. Sarah had to set it right. But how? Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting the room into brief darkness before they returned to their dim state. In that fleeting moment, Sarah saw it. A vision of Eleanor in her wedding gown, standing at the altar, waiting for a groom who would never come. The scene was so vivid, so real, that it felt as though Sarah herself was stepping into the past, becoming part of that fateful day. But when she reached out toward the bride, the vision fractured, the air filled with an overwhelming pressure, and she was thrust back into the present, gasping for breath. Eleanor's form flickered again, this time closer, her voice growing stronger. "I am trapped," she whispered. "You must release me from this dress, or I will never be free." Sarah understood then. She wasn't just a witness to Eleanor's sorrow, she was part of the solution. The dress was the prison, and only by releasing it could Eleanor's spirit find peace. But the question remained, how could she do that? The weight of Eleanor's plea hung heavily in the air, pressing down on Sarah's chest. She had no idea how to break the connection between the bride and the dress, but she was determined to find a way. The haunting presence that had plagued her for days now seemed to reach a fever pitch, as if Eleanor's spirit was growing more desperate with each passing moment. Sarah couldn't bear to see her suffer any longer. The first step, she realized, was to understand the history of the dress itself. She returned to the second-hand shop, determined to ask the shopkeeper more about its origins. The moment Sarah stepped through the door, the familiar bell above the entrance chimed, but the shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen. The shop was eerily quiet, and Sarah felt an unsettling chill sweep through the room. "Hello?" Sarah called, her voice hesitant as she stepped further into the store. Her eyes scanned the dusty shelves, the flickering lamps casting long, distorted shadows. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted something. The shopkeeper, sitting at the back of the store, hunched over in her rocking chair, as if waiting for Sarah to arrive. She was staring at the floor, her hands folded in her lap. As Sarah approached, the woman lifted her head, her expression unreadable. "You've come for the final piece, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. "The final piece?" Sarah repeated, confusion clouding her thoughts. The shopkeeper nodded, her eyes dark with some ancient understanding. "The dress holds the key to Eleanor's release. You can help her, but it will come with a cost. You must give her what she never had. A wedding, a ceremony, a goodbye." Sarah felt a wave of dread wash over her. "A wedding?" she repeated incredulously. "But I'm not." "You don't have to marry her," the shopkeeper interrupted with a faint smile. "But you must honor her, acknowledge her loss, and give her the closure she was denied. Only then will she be able to leave this world behind." It took Sarah a moment to process what the woman was saying, but then it hit her. The dress, Eleanor's spirit, the tears, the coldness. It was all bound to a broken promise, a future that had never come to pass. Eleanor had been denied a wedding, a celebration of love, and that had trapped her spirit in a cycle of grief. Perhaps if Sarah could give her that, even symbolically, it would release her. She left the shop, the weight of the task ahead settling over her like a shroud. That night, she laid the dress on her bed once more, this time with a sense of purpose. She lit candles around the room, their flickering flames casting soft shadows across the walls. Sarah dressed the mannequin she had borrowed in the wedding gown, carefully arranging the fabric, her fingers trembling as she did so. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, and she felt as though the dress itself was watching her, waiting. As the final candle was lit, Sarah stood before the mannequin, the stillness of the room broken only by the soft rustle of fabric. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice low and steady. "I honor you. I honor your love and your loss. I offer you the wedding you never had, the closure you were denied." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Sarah felt a rush of cold, almost as if she were standing in the presence of something ancient and powerful. For a moment, everything was silent, save for the sound of her own breath. And then, she saw it, the figure of Eleanor, standing at the foot of the bed. No longer a ghostly apparition, but a living, breathing woman. Her face was no longer filled with sorrow, but peaceful, as if the weight of years of grief had finally lifted from her shoulders. Eleanor reached out toward the dress, her fingers brushing the lace. A soft, almost imperceptible smile played across her lips as she turned toward Sarah. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now clear, filled with gratitude. "You've given me what I needed. I can rest now." The room seemed to exhale in relief, the oppressive cold lifting. As Eleanor's form began to fade, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over her. The dress, once heavy with sorrow, now felt light, as though it were no longer a burden but a cherished memory. Eleanor's spirit had been freed. The next morning, Sarah woke to find the apartment quiet, the atmosphere light and peaceful. She stood before the dress one last time, her heart full of gratitude. She knew she had helped Eleanor find peace, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the grip of fear that had plagued her for so long. The dress, now an heirloom of bittersweet memories, was no longer an object of terror, but a symbol of closure and release. As Sarah packed the dress away carefully, ready to pass it on to another, she couldn't help but smile. It was a new beginning, not just for her, but for Eleanor as well. The past had been laid to rest, and with it, the haunting whispers of a bride who had never walked down the aisle. Maggie had always been drawn to antiques. She wasn't sure what it was about the dust, the age, or the stories each piece might hold, but something always compelled her to browse through second-hand shops, flea markets, and estate sales. It was a simple Sunday afternoon when she stumbled upon the dress. It was tucked at the back of a small shop, the fabric folded neatly, almost forgotten. It wasn't the first wedding dress she had seen in the store, but this one was different. There was something about its delicate lace and the intricate beadwork that seemed to call to her. As soon as she touched the fabric, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She could almost hear whispers in the back of her mind, but she shook it off as nothing more than her imagination. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with trembling hands, had looked at Maggie curiously when she picked up the dress. "It's from a long time ago," the woman had said. "I don't know much about it. Came from a local estate. You'd be surprised what people keep." She seemed hesitant, as if there was something more she wanted to say, but instead, she just smiled thinly, the lines of her face deepening. Maggie had already decided, though. The dress was beautiful, and she loved the idea of wearing something with a history, even if it was just for a small gathering she had planned in the coming months. The price was reasonable, far more affordable than anything she'd seen in modern bridal shops. It felt like fate. But as she left the shop with the dress wrapped carefully in a bag, the air outside felt heavier, as though something had followed her from that quiet little shop. That night, as she settled into her apartment, Maggie decided to try on the dress. It fit perfectly, though it felt a little colder than she had expected. Standing in front of the full-length mirror, she admired herself, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection staring back at her wasn't entirely her own. The dress was exquisite, but there was something unsettling about it, a sense of being watched. The longer she stared, the more she swore she saw something move behind her in the reflection, something she couldn't quite place. When she spun around quickly, there was nothing there, just the empty room behind her. Later that evening, as Maggie lay in bed, she felt an odd, inexplicable heaviness. Her thoughts wandered back to the dress, and she found herself wondering about its origins. Why had it been abandoned? Who had worn it? Was it truly just an old, forgotten piece, or was there more to it than she understood? As she pondered these questions, a chill ran through the room, and she suddenly felt as though someone was standing beside her. She sat up, her heart racing, but there was no one there. Still, the sense of a presence lingered, cold and unrelenting. When Maggie turned off the lamp and pulled the covers tighter around her, the air grew still, and sleep finally overcame her. But she was not alone. In the silence of the night, something cold brushed against her neck, fingers cold as ice, wrapping slowly around her throat. She gasped, but no sound escaped her lips. Her heart pounded as the grip tightened, and she reached up, her hands desperately clawing at the invisible force that held her. She could feel the fingers, icy and unforgiving, pressing against her skin. Just as quickly as it had begun, the sensation vanished. Maggie gasped for air, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her neck, feeling the phantom coldness linger like a ghostly mark. The next morning, Maggie woke with a sense of unease that wouldn't leave her. Her neck ached, and there was a lingering chill in the apartment, as though the night's events had left an imprint. She had trouble convincing herself it had been a dream. She was no stranger to vivid nightmares, but this felt different. It was real. And something told her that the dress was the key. As the days passed, Maggie began to notice strange things. At random moments, she would catch a glimpse of something, a flash of white in the corner of her vision, or the image of a woman, pale and tear-streaked, reflected in mirrors or windows. But when she turned to look, no one was there. The sensation of cold hands around her neck came again and again, never enough to truly harm her, but always enough to unsettle her. She tried to dismiss it as stress, perhaps from moving into a new place, or maybe even a trick of the mind. But deep down, Maggie knew something was wrong. The whispers grew louder. Maggie hadn't yet told anyone about the strange occurrences. She wasn't ready to explain to her friends how a beautiful dress had begun to haunt her. She didn't want to appear irrational, but every time she walked past a mirror, she felt that pull, a strange tugging sensation at the back of her mind. The reflections seemed to shift, just slightly, as if someone else was standing beside her, staring back at her with sad eyes. At first, she tried to ignore it, telling herself it was simply her mind playing tricks. But the feeling of being watched was always there, never fading. One night, after a long day at work, Maggie was drawn to the dress again. She found herself standing in front of the mirror once more, tracing the delicate lace with her fingers. As her hand moved over the fabric, she felt the room grow colder, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the evening. The air was thick with an unspoken presence, and her breath fogged up the glass before her, as though the temperature had dropped drastically. It wasn't just the mirror. It was the entire room that felt wrong. As her eyes locked onto her own reflection, she swore she saw the outline of a woman standing behind her, the pale, ghostly figure of a bride. Maggie spun around, heart hammering in her chest. There was nothing there, just the empty space behind her. She let out a shaky laugh, dismissing the panic rising in her throat. It was late. She was tired. The dress had simply triggered her imagination. But when she turned back to the mirror, she saw her reflection again, a pale woman with dark, wet eyes staring back at her, dressed in the same vintage gown. Her breath caught in her throat, and this time, she didn't dare turn away. The woman in the mirror was crying, her face twisted with grief and sorrow. She could feel the tension building in her chest, an overwhelming sense of dread flooding her body. Maggie stepped back, and as she did, the woman's figure seemed to grow clearer. The bride in the mirror slowly lifted her head, her eyes never leaving Maggie's, and mouthed a single word. "Help." Maggie recoiled, stumbling backward into a chair. Her heart raced as she tried to catch her breath, but her mind refused to settle. Who was this woman? Why was she crying? And why did she feel so connected to the dress? The sense of coldness had enveloped her once more, and she was certain the room was not the same. The air felt thick, as though she were standing at the edge of something, teetering between the living and the dead. The silence in the room became deafening, suffocating. Every inch of her skin prickled, as if the atmosphere itself were alive, watching her every move. The next morning, Maggie tried to continue with her daily routine, but the haunting images wouldn't leave her. Every mirror she passed seemed to reflect the bride, and the cold hands on her neck had become a nightly occurrence. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think straight. The woman in the mirror, who was she? What did she want? Maggie began to feel as if the very fabric of her life was unraveling, as though the dress was a thread that tied her to something darker than she could comprehend. In desperation, Maggie reached out to an old friend, Laura, who had always been interested in the supernatural. Laura had always indulged Maggie's interest in the unusual, but this was different. This wasn't just curiosity, this was fear. "I think something is wrong with the dress," Maggie confessed over the phone, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like it's alive. Like it's haunted. And I keep seeing this woman. She's always in the mirrors, and every night she—" Laura interrupted her, her tone turning serious. "Maggie, do you remember that antique store you bought it from? The one with the old woman?" Maggie froze, a knot tightening in her stomach. "What's wrong with it?" she asked cautiously. "I did some research on that place a while ago," Laura continued. "It's not just any antique store. Some of the things sold there have strange histories, especially the wedding dresses. There's the story about one dress that was linked to a tragedy. A woman was left at the altar and the dress was found years later in the same shop you bought it from. People say it's cursed." Maggie felt her stomach drop. A curse? Was that possible? She had heard stories like this, of course, but she never imagined she would be caught in one. "What do I do, Laura?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to get rid of it." Laura's response was cautious. "You need to take it back. Return it to the store. You can't keep something like that in your home. If it really is cursed, you could be in danger." The thought of returning the dress felt impossible. She had already worn it, already connected with it in ways she couldn't explain. But the more she thought about the woman in the mirror, the grief in her eyes, the more she realized that the dress was not just a piece of clothing. It was a bridge, and Maggie was standing on it. Maggie couldn't ignore the warning any longer. Laura's words echoed in her mind as she lay awake that night, listening to the silence of her apartment. The dress, no, the woman, was not something she could simply leave behind. But could she really take it back to the shop? The thought filled her with unease. The more she tried to rationalize it, the more tangled her thoughts became. It wasn't just a dress, it was a part of something, a thread woven into the very fabric of her being now. Every night, she saw that woman, heard her whispers, felt her presence like a cold shadow following her everywhere she went. The next day, Maggie made the decision. She couldn't live like this. Something had to be done. She would return the dress. She would return it, and maybe, just maybe, she could rid herself of the feeling of cold hands on her neck and the sound of quiet sobs at night. But even as she dressed, her heart sank. A strange anxiety gripped her chest. She could feel the woman's eyes on her, as though she were already watching, waiting, knowing what Maggie was planning. The shop was only a few blocks away, and the streets seemed eerily empty as Maggie walked toward it. The world around her felt muted, distant, as if the entire city was holding its breath. The air was unnaturally still, and the chill she had come to associate with the dress lingered, thick and oppressive. She reached the door of the antique store and hesitated. The small bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, but it felt wrong, like the sound had been warped, distorted. The shopkeeper was there, standing behind the counter. Her eyes seemed to glisten with an unnatural awareness as she looked up at Maggie, a strange, knowing smile on her face. "Back so soon?" the woman asked, her voice low, almost too soft. Maggie forced a smile, clutching the dress bag tightly in her hands. I need to return it," Maggie said, her voice trembling. It's not right. There's something wrong with it." She could feel the woman's eyes upon her, cold and assessing. The shopkeeper didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her fingers lightly tapping on the counter, as though weighing Maggie's words. "You're not the first," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. Many who have bought that dress have come back, claiming the same thing. But the dress, it doesn't want to be returned. Her smile deepened, and for a moment, Maggie thought she saw something flicker in the woman's eyes. A trace of something darker, more ancient than anything she had ever seen. Maggie's heart began to race. The words made no sense, but they made a horrible kind of sense. The dress wasn't just a thing. It had a will of its own, a desire to stay in the world. "I have to get rid of it," Maggie whispered, more to herself than to the shopkeeper. The woman's smile faded and her gaze turned colder. "It's not that simple. That dress was never meant to be worn again. It's cursed, you see. The bride's soul, it never left. She still walks, searching for what she lost." A chill swept through Maggie, but it wasn't the same as before. This time it was worse, more intense, as though the room itself had turned to ice. She reached for the dress, about to hand it back to the woman, but her hand froze midair. A faint sound filled the room, a soft sobbing, as though someone was crying from within the folds of the dress itself. The noise came from nowhere and everywhere, surrounding Maggie with an overwhelming sorrow. "Do you hear it?" The shopkeeper's voice was barely audible now, almost drowned by the sound of weeping. "She mourns for the life she was denied, and she won't stop until she finds it." Maggie took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to leave. She had to leave. But as she turned to go, something cold gripped her wrist. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat, and whipped around to find no one there. The coldness intensified, as if fingers made of ice were clutching her, squeezing, holding her in place. Panic surged through her. The shopkeeper was now watching her intently, her expression unreadable, but her eyes glittered with something that felt like triumph. "You can leave," the woman said softly, her voice no longer kind. "But the dress will not be returned. It will come back to you, and she will always be with you, Maggie. You cannot escape her." Maggie tore herself free from the invisible grasp and ran from the shop, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. The sobbing, the coldness, followed her down the street, and the image of the bride, her tear-streaked face, her empty eyes, clung to Maggie's mind like a shadow that refused to fade. Back at her apartment, Maggie locked every door and shut all the windows. The dress was back in its bag, lying silently on the floor, but Maggie felt as though her being suffocated by its presence. She turned every mirror away from sight, unable to face the reflection of the woman who was always there, staring at her. She had been wrong to think that returning the dress would end it. It wasn't just an object, it was a spirit, a lost soul tied to a piece of fabric, and Maggie was its new host. The days dragged on, and Maggie's life began to fall apart at the seams. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept through the night, couldn't recall a moment when the cold, oppressive feeling that clung to her hadn't been present. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bride, her tear-streaked face, her outstretched arms, her silent, pleading eyes. Maggie could hear the sobbing more clearly now, always faint, always distant, but unrelenting. It followed her everywhere. The whispers in the mirrors had become louder, clearer, like a broken record, always repeating the same mournful words, "Help me." Maggie couldn't escape it. No matter how far she ran, no matter how many locks she bolted on the doors or how tightly she shut the curtains, the presence was there, lurking in every corner of her apartment, hanging in the air like a thick fog. It pressed on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. And the nights were the worst. Every evening, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, she could feel the temperature drop, the room growing colder, the weight of an unseen figure settling beside her. Her neck would ache, as though fingers were once again curling around it, and always the bride's face would appear, never far away, always just behind her in the mirror, watching with mournful eyes. Maggie had become a shell of herself. She had stopped going to work, stopped answering calls, stopped interacting with the world beyond her apartment. Her only company was the bride, whose sorrow seemed to consume her entirely. The mirror in her hallway had become the most terrifying thing in her home. It was always there, reflecting the woman who would not let Maggie go. One night, Maggie couldn't take it anymore. The sobbing was louder than ever, and the figure of the bride, her face a twisted mask of grief, had appeared in every reflection in her apartment. No matter where Maggie looked, she was there, standing behind her, her eyes locked on hers. She felt as if she were suffocating, drowning in the bride's unspoken sorrow. And for the first time, Maggie understood the depth of the woman's pain. She had been abandoned, left behind on the day that should have been the happiest of her life. Her wedding day, the day when she was meant to be adored, loved, cherished, was now a distant, broken memory, forever tied to the dress. Maggie couldn't keep running. She had to confront the bride, had to understand why this was happening. She walked toward the mirror in the hallway, her steps slow, deliberate. The sobbing grew louder as she approached, and the temperature dropped so sharply that her breath clouded in the air. She could feel the presence of the bride, could feel her eyes boring into her, could almost feel her cold, ghostly hands reaching out, longing for something that Maggie could not give. But there was something else now, something Maggie had never noticed before, a deep, powerful sorrow that didn't just come from the bride, but from within herself. With trembling hands, Maggie placed her palm against the glass. The reflection rippled like water disturbed by a stone. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she let herself be consumed by the emotion, the grief, the unbearable sadness that she had tried to suppress. She felt the bride's pain, her loss, her hopelessness. She had been abandoned, left to die alone, and Maggie could not help but empathize with her. The dress, the spirit, the coldness, they weren't just haunting Maggie. They were a reflection of her own loneliness, her own unresolved grief. Suddenly, the sobbing stopped. The room grew still, eerily silent. Maggie opened her eyes, and in the mirror she no longer saw the bride. Instead, she saw herself, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with shock. But the sorrow, the grief, it was no longer the bride's alone. It was Maggie's as well. The dress had not cursed her. It had not trapped her. It had connected her to something deeper, something that had been buried inside her all along. The bride's spirit had not come to torment her. She had come to help her understand. Maggie's own heart had been broken, shattered in ways she hadn't even realized. The sorrow of the bride had awakened something in Maggie, something she had been too afraid to confront. With a sob of her own, Maggie fell to her knees, her hands clutching her chest. The weight that had crushed her for so long, the weight of grief, of loss, of abandonment, was finally being released. And in that moment, the air in the room lightened. The coldness, the shadows, the presence of the bride, they all faded, as if the spirit had found peace at last. Maggie felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of relief she hadn't known in years. The room was no longer oppressive. It was quiet, calm. The dress, still lying in its bag, no longer seemed so threatening. Maggie stood slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the dress. It had served its purpose. It had brought her face to face with the part of herself she had been running from. And now, she could let it go. She walked to the door, the dress clutched tightly in her hands, and opened it. As she stepped out into the world again, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't free of everything. There would be more to face, more to heal. But for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt as though she could breathe. The bride was gone, her spirit released. And Maggie, though still broken in many ways, was ready to begin the journey of healing. She didn't need the dress to remember her, to remember what she had lost. The journey, she realized, was hers to make.